They laughed when the janitor was dared to touch the lobby's grand piano. The words weren't whispered. They were tossed out loud, sharp and amused, meant to sting. Someone added that maintenance hands ruined ivory keys. Another voice said the piano cost more than his yearly wages. Laughter rolled through the lobby, polished shoes shifting on marble, eyes turning toward the man with the mop. By the way, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. What was really happening beneath the surface wasn't a joke or a dare. It was a test of who was allowed to exist in that space and who was meant to disappear quietly into service corridors. The janitor didn't argue. He didn't smile either. He removed his gloves with care, folded them once, and rested them on the cleaning cart as if time had slowed just for him, and the lobby lights hummed overhead. Phones were already lifting. The CEO's smirk lingered, confident, entertained. No one expected the silence that followed, the kind that presses against the chest and waits. He had been standing there for hours already, long before the crowd arrived, long before the piano became a stage. Adrian Cole's shift always started before the building felt alive, when the air still carried the echo of yesterday's power. He worked where no one looked, polished floors that reflected glass walls and expensive art, and learned the rhythm of the tower the way others learned music. Calm wasn't an act for him. It was survival. He moved with the steadiness of someone used to swallowing reactions. The mop bucket rolled back as he stepped away from it, his boots quiet against the marble. There was no rush in him, no heat in his face, just a familiar tightening in his chest, the same one he felt every time someone decided his uniform defined his limits. His thoughts didn't go to the CEO or the crowd. They went somewhere smaller, a narrow apartment, a kitchen table with one unsteady leg. A little girl hunched over homework, pausing every few minutes to catch her breath, insisting she was fine even when she wasn't. Everything he did bent toward that image, every shift, every silence. Earlier that evening, before the donors arrived, he'd wiped fingerprints from the piano's black surface. He'd noticed the slight imbalance in the bench, the way one pedal returned a fraction slower than the others. Muscle memory had stirred then, uninvited, quickly buried. That wasn't his world anymore, and that world had asked for too much and given him too little time to grieve. Now, the piano sat under lights meant to impress, not to listen. It was decoration, like him. The CEO, Maribel Voss, stood a few steps away, perfectly composed in a tailored dress that cost more than his car. She hadn't ordered the dare directly. She hadn't needed to. Her raised eyebrow had been enough. Power moved through her like habit. Security shifted, uncertain. A manager half-stepped forward, then stopped. No one wanted to be responsible for interrupting whatever this was becoming. The janitor's presence at the piano felt wrong to them, like oil near silk. Adrian sat. The bench didn't creak. His hands hovered, not touching yet, fingers flexing once as if remembering their shape. A ripple of laughter tried to restart and failed. The room waited. Breath held between curiosity and cruelty. Somewhere above, the HVAC system sighed. Somewhere behind him, a glass clinked. He felt the weight of eyes, the old familiar heat of being underestimated. He also felt something steadier underneath it, something earned long ago and never entirely lost. He thought of his daughter again, of how she'd asked that morning why he always looked tired but never angry. He hadn't answered then. He didn't need to now. The first note hadn't come yet. That was still waiting. This moment was about choice, about whether he would retreat the way they expected, apologize for existing too loudly. He didn't. Maribel Voss crossed her arms, amusement sharpening into interest. She'd built her life on reading rooms, on knowing when someone was bluffing. From where she stood, Alice looked like a man about to embarrass himself. She didn't see the quiet alignment happening inside him, the way years of restraint were settling into focus. His fingers lowered. Not to play, not yet. Just to rest on the keys, feeling their cool resistance. The laughter was gone now, replaced by something thinner. Anticipation. Doubt. Whatever happened next would not belong to the building or the piano, or the people who thought they owned both. It would belong to him. The room didn't breathe. It waited. His fingers still rested on the keys, not pressing, not retreating. The silence stretched just long enough to make people uncomfortable, long enough for a few executives to shift their weight and glance toward Maribel Voss as if she might signal how this was supposed to end. She didn't. She watched him with narrowed interest. Chin lifted, arms crossed, already confident that this moment would bend back in her favor. He felt the familiar burn in his wrists, not pain, but memory. Years of practice lived there, stored deeper than thought. He exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that steadied him during long nights when sleep never came easy. The keys were cool, clean, expensive. They didn't care who touched them. A murmur rippled near the back of the crowd. Someone whispered that security should stop this. Someone else laughed again, thinner this time, trying to reclaim the joke. The building's glass walls reflected the scene back at itself. A janitor at a piano, a CEO watching, 100 witnesses unsure which side they were on. He pressed the first note. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was precise. The sound slid across the marble floor and climbed the walls, clear and deliberate. The kind of note that didn't ask for permission. Conversations cut off mid-breath. A phone dipped, forgotten. Even the HVAC hum seemed to fade beneath it. He didn't look up. His eyes stayed on the keys as his other hand joined in, shaping something measured and restrained. Not a showpiece. Not yet. This was grounding, a reminder to himself more than anyone else that he was exactly where he needed to be. Maribel felt it before she understood it, a tightening just below her ribs, sharp and unexpected. She'd commissioned that piano for appearances, for donors who liked symbols of culture more than the work itself. She'd heard it played well before. This wasn't that. This felt intentional, personal. She straightened slightly, her smile faltering. The janitor's shoulders were relaxed now, his posture different, aligned. This wasn't a man guessing. This was a man returning. A board member leaned toward another, whispering a question neither of them could answer. Someone near the front swallowed hard. The sound filled the lobby without overpowering it, weaving through the space like it belonged there more than the people did. He shifted into a progression that made a few listeners close their eyes without realizing it. There was restraint in it, discipline. He wasn't playing to impress. He was playing to tell the truth, and that difference carried weight. This is where I remind you. If you're feeling that tension building, subscribe with the bell on. Stories like this don't rush the truth, but they always deliver it. Maribel's fingers curled against her arm. A memory stirred, gone welcome. A younger version of herself, sitting in a recital hall she hadn't thought about in years. Someone else on a stage, someone she'd loved once. She pushed the thought away, irritation flaring at herself for letting a maintenance worker's performance unsettle her. But the music didn't let go. He transitioned smoothly, hands moving with quiet authority. The janitor cart sat abandoned behind him, gloves folded neatly on top. The contrast was impossible to ignore now. This wasn't novelty. This was expertise. A manager took a step back, eyes wide, as if realizing too late that something irreversible was happening. Phones came back up, not to mock now but to capture. The crowd had shifted from spectators to witnesses. He felt it too, the change in the air. The moment when the room stopped testing him and started listening. His jaw tightened briefly, not with anger but with control. He kept going, each note placed with care, building toward something deeper. Maribel's confidence cracked in small, almost invisible ways. Her breathing changed. Her gaze fixed on his hands, then lifted to his face, searching for something she couldn't name. This wasn't part of her plan. Money didn't stop this. Status didn't redirect it. A donor near the piano whispered a name under their breath. A pianist they'd once heard in another life. The whisper didn't reach her, but the unease did. Reputation moved faster than authority in moments like this. He reached the end of the phrase and didn't stop. He let the final note hang, vibrating softly, then guided the music forward again, stronger now. The restraint was gone. Purpose took its place. Maribel's throat tightened, and the memory she'd buried pushed harder, pressing against the wall she'd built so carefully. She told herself this was ridiculous. He was just a janitor. He was supposed to fail. But the sound said otherwise. The lobby no longer belonged to her. It belonged to the music, and to the man who had decided, finally, not to disappear. The sound kept moving forward, no longer cautious, no longer restrained. It filled the lobby with something heavier than volume, intent. People who had come for champagne and small talk now stood rooted, their bodies leaning almost imperceptibly toward the piano, as if pulled by a current they hadn't agreed to enter. He didn't play like someone showing off. There were no exaggerated flourishes, no theatrical pauses meant to earn applause. Each transition was clean, disciplined, earned. The kind of playing that came from repetition done in private, from nights where no one watched and no one praised. His shoulders stayed loose, his back straight, breath steady. This wasn't rebellion, it was memory. Maribel Voss felt her pulse in her ears. She told herself she was imagining the shift in the room. The donors were only quiet because novelty demanded it. Yet she could feel something slipping past her authority, moving underneath it. The janitor hadn't asked permission. He hadn't needed it. A woman near the piano lowered her phone, eyes wide. "That progression," she murmured, trailing off. The man beside her frowned, then nodded slowly, recognition dawning without a name. Whispers began again, softer now, uncertain, no longer cruel. He transitioned into a section that carried weight differently. The notes bent, not sloppy, but emotional, shaped by loss rather than performance. His jaw set, a faint tightening that came and went. For a moment, the building felt too small for what he was letting out. Across town, a little girl sat cross-legged on a couch, tapping her fingers against her knee the way he'd taught her, counting quietly, breathing carefully between numbers. He didn't know she was doing that. He only knew why his chest ached when the melody turned. A donor near the back inhaled sharply. "That's not amateur," he whispered, louder than he meant to. Heads turned toward him. He flushed, then added, "I heard something like this years ago, at a conservatory fundraiser. Different hands, same discipline." The whisper moved. It didn't shout, it didn't accuse. It simply traveled, passing from mouth to mouth, changing shape as it went. Reputation didn't announce itself. It leaked. Maribel's fingers dug into her arm. Conservatory. The word hit harder than she expected. She stared at the man at the piano, really looked this time. Not at the uniform, not at the cart behind him, but at the way his wrists aligned, the economy of motion in his hands. Her breath stuttered, and with it came a memory she'd spent years locking away. A smaller hall, red velvet seats, a man on a stage, younger, eyes closed, lost in something she hadn't been able to compete with. She swallowed, anger flaring at herself for letting this resurface. She had chosen power, chosen certainty. She hadn't regretted it. She refused to now. He moved into a quieter passage, drawing the room in closer instead of pushing it back. The lobby's echoes softened. Even the marble seemed to listen. Somewhere, a glass slipped from a hand and shattered, the sound sharp and wrong against the music. No one reacted. Security stood frozen, unsure when intervention had become impossible. A manager stared at Maribel, waiting for a cue that didn't come. Authority had no script for moments like this. The janitor's thoughts stayed narrow, focused. He felt the keys under his fingers, the resistance just right, the bench steady despite its earlier wobble. He remembered adjusting a bench like this once, years ago, tightening bolts backstage before a performance that had mattered more than any review. The memory passed through him without stopping. He reached a point where the piece demanded more pressure, more presence. His hands answered without hesitation. The sound swelled, not louder, but fuller, expanding into the space like breath-filling lungs long deprived of air. Someone near the piano wiped at their eyes, startled by the gesture. They laughed quietly at themselves, embarrassed, then stopped laughing when they realized they weren't alone. Maribel felt the first tear before she understood what it was. It surprised her, hot and immediate. She blinked hard, lifting her chin, refusing to let anyone see. This was absurd. She was in control. She always was. But the music kept going, and with it came the undeniable truth that money couldn't interrupt this, that status couldn't redirect it. Whatever this man had been, whatever he still was, it existed outside her reach. He didn't look up. He didn't need to. The room had already changed. The crowd no longer saw a janitor defying a dare. So they saw a man reclaiming something in plain sight, and they were complicit now, witnesses whether they wanted to be or not. As the final notes of the section resolved into a held chord, the air trembled with it. No applause followed. Not yet. Something more fragile hung there instead, waiting to be named. The held chord lingered, vibrating softly through the lobby, refusing to disappear on command. No one moved to fill the space it left behind. Applause would have been easier, expected. Silence demanded more honesty. He let the sound fade on its own. His hands stayed on the keys. Fingers relaxed now, as if resting after a long walk. For the first time since sitting down, he lifted his gaze. Not to the crowd as a whole, but upward, toward the glass-lined balcony where the executives stood like observers behind a barrier. Maribel Voss felt that look land on her before she fully understood it was directed at her. It wasn't challenging, it wasn't pleading, it was steady, unafraid, and deeply inconvenient. Her breath caught again, sharper this time, and she hated that her body reacted before her mind could organize a response. A cough broke the silence near the back. Another followed. Someone shifted their feet. The room seemed to remember itself all at once, but not in the way it had been moments earlier. The air felt thinner now, stripped of pretense. He turned back to the piano and continued. This time, the piece changed. The structure loosened, moving into something less formal, more personal. The melody carried the weight of repetition and return, of leaving and coming back to the same place with different hands. His shoulders rose and fell with the phrasing, breath sinking to sound. This wasn't performance anymore. It was conversation, one he hadn't intended to have in public. Maribel's composure fractured in increments so small she might have denied them later. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes burned. She pressed her lips together, tasting salt she didn't want. Around her, donors exchanged uncertain glances, their confidence draining as quickly as the room's earlier laughter had. She remembered the last time she'd heard this style of playing. Not the piece itself, but the discipline behind it. Someone who didn't rush climaxes. Someone who understood restraint as power. The memory slammed into her with unwanted clarity, dragging with it a decision she'd buried under years of success. Her hand went to the railing. The glass was cool, grounding. She told herself this was coincidence. Talent existed everywhere. That didn't explain the ache spreading through her chest, the way the music seemed to know exactly where to press. On the floor below, a board member leaned toward another, whispering urgently. "This is going to get out," he said. The other nodded, eyes never leaving the piano. Phones were no longer raised for mockery or novelty. They were steady now, documenting, preserving. This wasn't a joke to share later. This was evidence. He felt the shift even without looking. The way the room leaned in instead of away. The way breaths synchronized unconsciously. The way judgment gave way to something closer to respect. It didn't inflate him. It steadied him. His mind flickered briefly, uninvited, to a hospital room years ago. To a monitor beeping too fast. To a choice made under pressure that had cost him everything else he loved. The melody bent around that memory, not collapsing under it, but carrying it forward. A tear slipped free down Maribel's cheek before she could stop it. She swiped at it quickly, anger flashing hot and defensive. She wasn't weak, she wasn't sentimental. She had built her empire by controlling rooms, not surrendering to them. But this room wasn't hers anymore. The janitor's cart sat off to the side, absurd in its ordinariness. A few minutes earlier, it had defined him. Now it looked like what it was. A tool, not an identity. The contrast gnawed at her, exposing how easily she'd accepted the story his uniform told. The music softened again, drawing toward something intimate. People who had never met him felt like they were being led in on a private truth. A woman near the piano clasped her hands together, knuckles white. A man beside her exhaled slowly, eyes glassy, unsure why. Security exchanged looks, then settled back. There was nothing to stop, no rule to enforce. The moment had moved beyond protocol. He reached a passage that demanded vulnerability. His fingers hesitated for half a beat, then pressed on. The sound wavered, not from lack of skill but from weight. His throat tightened. He swallowed, grounding himself in the bench beneath him, in the keys beneath his hands. Maribel's control finally cracked in a way she couldn't disguise. Her shoulders slumped, just a fraction. Her eyes closed for a brief, unguarded second. When she opened them, something had shifted permanently. This wasn't about a dare anymore. It wasn't about a janitor out of place. It was about a truth she had spent years outrunning, now catching up to her in front of everyone who mattered. He played on, unaware of the exact shape her unraveling took, only aware that the room was no longer hostile. It was listening, and whatever came next would demand more than applause. The music slowed, not fading but narrowing, drawing the room inward as if it were being folded around a single point. He felt it in his chest first, the familiar pressure that came when a piece approached its most honest moment. This was where most performers reached for drama. He didn't. He reached for truth. A woman in the front row shifted, pressing a hand to her mouth. Someone else stepped back unconsciously, as though afraid to interrupt the fragile balance settling over the lobby. The marble floors, the glass walls, and the towering art installations, all of it felt suddenly irrelevant, reduced to a shell holding something far more human. Maribel Voss lowered her head slightly, the balcony rail cool beneath her fingers. Her breathing had changed without her permission, shallow and uneven. She recognized the passage now, not by name, but by feeling. It was the kind of movement that carried regret without asking forgiveness. Her throat tightened again, harder this time, and she didn't fight it. The final notes of the piece approached, not with grandeur, but with resolve. His hands moved with deliberate care, each key pressed as if it mattered more than the last. He felt the weight of the room, the attention he had never asked for, and let it pass through him instead of settling. This wasn't about being seen, it was about being finished. He played the last chord and released it gently. Silence followed, deeper than before. It wasn't empty, it was full of everything the music had stirred and nowhere to put it yet. No one clapped, no one spoke. The pause stretched long enough to feel intentional, as if the room itself was deciding what it had just witnessed. Then Maribel moved. She straightened slowly, one hand still gripping the railing as if to steady herself. The motion drew eyes upward, attention snapping into focus. Her face was composed again, but something raw lingered beneath the polish, visible to anyone who knew how to look. She didn't smile. Her gaze dropped to the man at the piano, and for the first time that night she didn't see a uniform. She saw discipline, sacrifice, a past that hadn't vanished just because it no longer fit her narrative. Her lips parted as if to speak, then closed again. Whatever she'd planned to say dissolved under the weight of the moment. Below, murmurs began to ripple outward, careful and subdued. A donor leaned toward another. That wasn't random," he said quietly. The other nodded, eyes still fixed on the piano. No, that was trained. Phones shifted again, now openly recording, no longer ashamed of it. This wasn't mockery to be shared later. This was history in the making, and people sensed it. He stood from the bench without ceremony. The motion felt strange after sitting so long, knees stiff, shoulders heavy. He turned, finally facing the room fully. The applause started then, hesitant at first, then building as if people needed permission to let it out. It swelled quickly, filling the lobby with sound that felt almost intrusive after the silence. He didn't bow, he didn't smile. He simply nodded once, small and controlled, and stepped away from the piano. Maribel descended the stairs slowly. Every step watched. The applause softened as she approached, uncertainty creeping back in. Power still clung to her presence, but it had shifted shape. It no longer dominated the room, it had to share it. She stopped a few feet from him. The distance felt charged, heavy with unspoken recognition. Her eyes were bright, not with anger now, but with something closer to reckoning. "This," she began, then paused, visibly recalibrating. "Wasn't what I expected." He met her gaze calmly. He didn't fill the silence. He didn't need to. The truth had already done its work. Around them, people leaned in, hungry for resolution. This was the moment where authority usually reasserted itself, where the story snapped back into familiar order. But the order had already been disrupted. Maribel inhaled deeply. Her voice, when it came, carried farther than she intended. "You should never have been put in that position." The words landed hard. Not because they were loud, but because they were public. Acknowledgement carried weight when witnesses were present. If you're still with me right now, don't go anywhere. And make sure you're subscribed, because moments like this are where everything changes. He didn't respond immediately. His attention flicked just briefly to the piano, then back to her. The room waited again, breath held. For the first time that night, the power dynamic was no longer one-sided. It balanced there between them, fragile and exposed. Whatever came next would ripple outward, beyond the lobby, beyond the building, beyond the roles they'd been assigned, and everyone watching knew it. The applause ebbed, leaving behind a nervous hush that felt heavier than noise. He stood still, hands at his sides, letting the moment settle without reaching for it. Maribel searched his face, expecting defensiveness, gratitude, something she could categorize. What she found instead was restraint. She straightened, drawing on years of practiced authority, but it didn't land the same. The crowd had seen too much, felt too much, to reset so easily. Board members exchanged looks that carried calculation rather than loyalty. Phones remained lifted, unhidden. He shifted his weight, boots scuffing softly, and glanced toward the service corridor out of habit. That was where he usually disappeared when attention sharpened. Tonight, the corridor felt farther away, like a door that had quietly locked. He breathed through the impulse to retreat. Maribel cleared her throat. The sound echoed more than she expected. "What's your name?" she asked, and the question rippled outward, simple but loaded. Titles had power because names were often denied. He gave it without embellishment, voice even, not raised to meet the room. Saying it aloud felt strange, like stepping back into shoes he'd outgrown and never truly left. A few people repeated it under their breath, testing how it sounded. Someone near the piano finally clapped again, then stopped, unsure whether it was appropriate. The uncertainty spread, dampening the applause until it dissolved into scattered taps. This wasn't celebration. It was reassessment. Maribel nodded once, slowly. "You should be upstairs," she said, gesturing toward the executive floors. The offer hung between them, heavy with implication. Elevation as apology, proximity as compensation. He didn't answer right away. He thought of his daughter waiting at home, the inhaler on the counter, the clock he watched every night. Upstairs meant delays, explanations, being folded into a world that had already taken enough. He shook his head slightly. The refusal startled her more than the music had. It wasn't defiance, it was boundary. The distinction unsettled her, forcing her to confront how rarely people said no without fear. Around them, witnesses leaned in, sensing the significance. He spoke then, not loudly, not carefully, just honestly. He explained he was there to do his job, and to clean what others left behind to go home on time. The words were simple, but they redrew the room's hierarchy. Maribel listened, truly listened, for the first time that night. Her shoulders lowered, tension easing in increments she couldn't fully control. She realized apology alone would never balance what had been exposed. Change would have to be visible. Around them, the lobby began to breathe again. Conversations resumed in cautious tones. The piano sat quiet now, no longer a prop, but a marker of something shifted. He felt the fatigue catch up to him, heavy and honest. A facilities supervisor approached, eyes darting between them, unsure whose permission mattered anymore. He paused, then simply nodded at the man beside the piano, a gesture small but telling. Respect moved differently now, earned rather than assigned. He retrieved his gloves from the cart, the familiar texture grounding him. Slipping them on felt like closing a loop, not retreating but choosing where he belonged. The cart's wheels squeaked softly as he turned it, sound ordinary and reassuring. Maribel watched him prepare to leave, the reality settling in that she could not undo what had happened with an invitation. Public moments demanded public follow-through. She turned to her board, already forming decisions that would be noticed. He paused at the edge of the lobby, looking back once at the piano. Not longing, not regret, just acknowledgement. What had been reclaimed didn't need to be carried forward into every space. As he stepped into the service corridor, the light shifted, softer and more familiar. The noise behind him dulled, replaced by the quiet hum of work unfinished. But the night wasn't over, but something essential had already been cleaned. Above, Maribel remained by the railing, staring at the empty bench. She understood now that authority without humility was brittle. The witnesses would remember how she responded next, not how she had laughed before. The corridor carried him forward, away from glass and judgment, toward routines that waited patiently. He pushed the cart, listening to its rhythm, thinking only of getting home on time. Tomorrow would come with questions. Tonight had given answers. Somewhere behind him, the building adjusted to a truth it couldn't ignore. Policies already bending under quiet pressure. The piano remained where it was, but its meaning had changed. So had the man who played it, without ever asking permission. The night shift stretched ahead, ordinary and necessary. He welcomed it. Work had always been honest to him. And now, finally, the world had listened long enough to hear why. That would be enough for tonight. It was. Here. The service corridor swallowed him in familiar shadows, the door closing with a soft click that sounded final in a way applause never could. The hum of fluorescent lights settled into his ears, steady and indifferent. He pushed the cart forward, the wheels complaining at the same spot they always did, and let the rhythm of work reclaim him. His hands moved automatically, muscle memory guiding him through tasks no one noticed unless they were left undone. Trash bins emptied, a spill wiped clean. The quiet order of labor soothed the lingering charge in his chest. Moments like the one he'd just left behind had a way of echoing if he let them. He didn't. He focused on the floor in front of him. Behind the lobby doors, the building adjusted. Maribel stood where he'd left her, the space around the piano still charged. Board members hovering with questions they didn't yet know how to phrase. She felt exposed in a way she hadn't anticipated, not by scandal but by sincerity. The witnesses hadn't needed her to say more. They'd seen enough. A senior advisor stepped closer, voice low. "We need to address this," he said, careful, not instructing, advising. That was new. She nodded slowly, eyes still fixed on the empty bench. "We will," she replied, and meant it. Damage control wasn't enough. That was the old instinct. This required correction, visible and deliberate. Phones buzzed softly as messages traveled faster than elevators. Clips were already circulating, as stripped of context and heavy with implication. A janitor, a dare, a performance that had unraveled something polished and powerful. She could almost see the headlines forming, and for once she didn't feel the urge to outrun them. In the corridor, he finished the last section of his route and leaned briefly against the cart, stretching his fingers. They ached now, the delayed cost of what he'd done. He welcomed the sensation. Pain was honest. It meant something had been used rather than buried. His phone vibrated in his pocket. He hesitated, then checked it. A message from a neighbor. Lena's breathing had been rough earlier, but she'd settled after her treatment. Relief loosened his shoulders. Whatever else tonight had stirred, that mattered most. He typed a quick reply, thanked them, and tucked the phone away. Home pulled at him now, stronger than curiosity about what would follow upstairs. He'd learned the hard way that peace rarely announced itself. You had to choose it when it showed up quietly. Back in the lobby, Maribel finally spoke again, this time to the room. Her voice carried without effort, not commanding but clear. She acknowledged the moment without naming excuses, without deflection. She spoke about dignity, about assumptions, about the cost of overlooking people who kept the building standing. The words weren't perfect. They were real. Some nodded. Some watched carefully, measuring sincerity against reputation. She accepted that scrutiny. It was part of the reckoning. Security relaxed visibly. Staff who had hovered on the edges stepped closer, emboldened by what they'd witnessed. A few caught each other's eyes, sharing looks that said things might be different now, or at least they might be seen. He clocked out on time. The punch of the card felt grounding, a familiar end to a long shift. He signed the log, hung up his vest, and stepped out into the night air. The city greeted him with traffic noise and damp pavement, ordinary and reassuring. The tower loomed behind him, glass catching reflections of things it could no longer fully contain. As he walked toward the bus stop, his thoughts drifted, not to the music, but to the look on the CEO's face when the truth had landed. Not triumph, recognition. That mattered more than applause ever could. Across town, Maribel sat alone in her office long after the donors had left. The piano footage replayed on her tablet, not for strategy but understanding. She paused it often, watching his hands, his posture, the moment he chose not to retreat. She recognized strength when she saw it. She just hadn't expected it to come from someone she'd dismissed. She drafted an internal memo and deleted it. Drafted another. This time, she kept it. Changes would be announced in the morning, not framed as charity but correction. Policies about staff treatment, visibility, respect. It wouldn't fix everything, it would be a start. At the bus stop, he sat on the cold bench, breath fogging in the air. The city moved around him, indifferent to glass towers and boardrooms. He liked that. The bus arrived with a sigh, doors opening like an invitation that didn't require explanation. He took a seat by the window, watching the tower recede as they pulled away. Whatever ripples tonight created would move on without him. He didn't need to follow them to feel whole. Yet somewhere, deep and unignorable, he knew the moment wasn't finished. Witnesses carried stories. Stories demanded responses. The truth had been set down in public, and it would not stay quiet. He rested his head back, closed his eyes, and let the motion carry him home. Tomorrow would ask new questions of the building he cleaned. Tonight had already answered one. Power had looked down and finally seen. The bus rocked gently as it pulled away from the curb, its windows rattling in a familiar rhythm. He let his head rest against the glass, eyes half closed, the city sliding past in blurred streaks of light. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a deep, settling fatigue that reached into his bones. This was the part no one saw, the quiet afterward, when everything heavy finally asked to be carried. Across town, Lena slept curled on her side, inhaler within reach on the nightstand. Her chest rose and fell in shallow but steady rhythm. The neighbor who watched her sat nearby with a book, glancing up every few minutes just to be sure. He pictured that small room clearly, the chipped paint, the faint hum of the old refrigerator. That image steadied him more than applause ever could. The bus hissed to a stop. He stood, joints stiff, and stepped down onto cracked pavement. The walk home was short, lined with familiar storefronts and dim streetlights that flickered like they always had. Nothing out here had changed. That felt right. What he didn't see was how fast the story was moving without him. By the time Maribel returned to her penthouse apartment, the video had spread beyond the building, beyond the city. Messages stacked up on her phone. Board members, partners, journalists cloaked as acquaintances. She ignored most of them, focusing instead on a single thread from a longtime donor who rarely reached out personally. That performance brought back things I thought I'd buried. We should talk. She set the phone down and stared out at the skyline. The glass reflected her back at herself, sharp and composed, but something beneath that image had cracked, not broken, shifted. She poured a drink she didn't touch and replayed the moment again in her mind. Not the music this time, but the look on his face when she'd offered him a way upstairs and he'd refused. That had been the real disruption. At home, he unlocked the door quietly and stepped inside, and the apartment smelled faintly of soup and cleaning solution. He set his bag down and checked on Lena first, crouching beside her bed, listening carefully. Her breathing held. Relief washed through him, slow and grounding. Only then did he sit at the small kitchen table. The silence pressed in, thick and intimate. His hands rested on the scarred surface, fingers still sore. He flexed them once, then stilled. Tonight had been unavoidable. Tomorrow would be harder. His phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't a neighbor. It was his supervisor, the message short and awkward, acknowledging the evening and asking him to come in early the next day. No explanation given, no tone specified. He stared at the screen, then typed a simple acknowledgement and set the phone face down. If you're still reading right now, make sure you're subscribed. And this is the part where quiet moments turn into consequences. Morning arrived without ceremony. He woke before his alarm, the habit ingrained. Lena stirred as he moved around the kitchen, her eyes fluttering open. She smiled sleepily when she saw him. A small, unguarded thing that cut through everything else. He smiled back, softer. At the tower, the atmosphere had changed overnight. Staff moved differently through the lobby, heads up, eyes alert. Conversations paused when he passed, not out of mockery but recognition. A few nodded. One woman offered a hesitant smile. He returned it and kept moving. Attention still made his shoulders tense, but he didn't shrink from it. Upstairs, Maribel convened an early meeting. The agenda was short and direct. Footage had gone viral. Commentary followed predictable lines: class, arrogance, redemption. She didn't waste time arguing narratives. She outlined immediate changes instead. Training, policy reviews, public acknowledgement of the incident without sanitizing it. Some resisted, some didn't. The room felt different now, less deferential. She accepted that too. Authority that couldn't absorb challenge wasn't worth holding. When he arrived at the facilities office, his supervisor cleared his throat and gestured for him to sit. The man looked uncomfortable, caught between relief and anxiety. He spoke about optics, about respect, about how none of them had known. The words stumbled over each other, apology tangled with self-protection. He listened without interrupting, then stood when the conversation ran out of useful ground. He wasn't there to negotiate identity, he was there to work. Later that morning, Maribel stepped into the lobby again. The piano stood where it always had, untouched. She approached it slowly, not as an owner now, but as someone who understood its weight. Staff watched from a distance, unsure what this visit meant. She didn't play. She simply placed a hand on the lid, closed her eyes briefly, and then turned away. Her gaze found him across the floor, pushing his cart, focused and steady. She nodded once. He nodded back. Nothing else needed to be said. The preparation was done. The truth was already in motion, and the next step would not be quiet. The building, for the first time, felt like it was listening. By midday, the tower no longer pretended the night before hadn't happened. Screens in the lobby cycled through muted news segments between corporate branding, captions careful but unmistakable. Employees slowed as they passed, glancing from the footage to the man pushing the cart, recalibrating stories they'd told themselves about who mattered and why. He kept his pace steady. The cart rolled, the wheels still catching at the same uneven tile near the elevators. Some things didn't change just because attention did. That consistency grounded him, even as whispers followed in softer tones than before. A young analyst stepped aside to let him pass, hesitated, then said thank you. The words were awkward, overthought. He nodded in return, not dismissive, not indulgent. Gratitude didn't need rehearsal. Upstairs, Maribel sat at the head of a long table, sunlight cutting sharp lines across polished wood. The meeting had shifted from reaction to strategy, but the tone was different than it had been in years. Less posturing, more caution. The board had seen how quickly control could slip when truth arrived without invitation. One executive cleared his throat. "The optics are complicated," he said carefully. "Some are calling it a PR disaster." Maribel didn't look at him. "Only if we pretend it didn't reveal something real," she replied. Her voice was calm, measured. "We don't get to control how people see us anymore. We only get to decide whether we're honest." Silence followed. Not agreement, not dissent, consideration. That was progress. In the service corridor, he paused to replace a burnt-out bulb. The latter wobbled slightly, familiar and annoying. He steadied it without thinking, muscle memory adjusting angles and pressure. The light flickered, then held. Brightness returned to a space designed never to be noticed. A facility's tech passing by slowed. "You ever think about doing something else?" he asked, gesturing vaguely, clearly referring to the elephant following him down the hall. He considered the question, then shook his head gently. "I am doing something," he said, and went back to work. The answer surprised even him with its certainty. Word spread beyond the building. Commentators dissected body language, rewound clips, speculated wildly. Some praised humility. Others accused performance. He didn't watch any of it. He'd learned long ago that other people's interpretations could swallow you whole if you let them. Maribel watched some late that night. Not out of vanity, but necessity. She needed to understand the narrative forming around her, around the company, around the moment. What struck her wasn't the outrage or the praise. It was how many people identified with the man at the piano. Stories poured in. Janitors, drivers, assistants. People with hidden histories and quiet skills, finally seeing themselves reflected back. That recognition unsettled her more than criticism ever had. It meant the problem wasn't isolated, it was structural. The next morning, she requested personnel files. Not to investigate him, to understand how many others had been flattened by assumptions, folded into roles without curiosity. The numbers disturbed her. She closed the folder slowly, feeling the weight of responsibility settle in a new way. Downstairs, he finished his route early and stepped outside to eat lunch on the low concrete wall near the loading dock. The air smelled of rain and exhaust. He unwrapped a sandwich, simple and familiar. As he ate, a woman from accounting approached hesitantly. "My mother used to play," she said, offering a small, shy smile. "She stopped when she had to work 2 jobs. Watching you, it mattered." He swallowed, nodded once. "I'm glad," he said. The words felt insufficient, but honest. She lingered a moment, then walked away lighter than she'd arrived. That afternoon, an internal memo went out company-wide. It didn't bury the incident in euphemism. It named what had happened. It acknowledged harm. It outlined changes. Training, reporting channels, a reevaluation of how labor was seen and treated. The tone was direct, unvarnished. People noticed. Maribel signed it herself, resisting the instinct to delegate. Accountability needed visibility. She understood that now. When she hit send, her hand trembled slightly, not from fear of backlash, from the awareness that this would reshape her legacy more than any acquisition ever had. He read the memo later, standing by a janitor's closet while waiting for a floor to clear. He scanned it once, then again, more slowly. Some of it rang true, some felt aspirational. He didn't judge it yet. Change earned trust over time. As his shift ended, he passed the piano once more. It sat silent, unadorned, no longer guarded by velvet ropes, just an instrument again. He paused, not to play, but to acknowledge the space where something had turned. A few people watched him from a distance, unsure what to expect. He gave them nothing dramatic, just a quiet nod and kept walking. The victory wasn't applause or recognition. It was this. The building could no longer pretend it hadn't seen him, and neither could anyone else. The following morning arrived wrapped in rain, the kind that softened edges and dampened sound. He arrived early, as always, unlocking doors that rarely noticed who held the keys. The lobby lights flickered on one by one, reflections stretching across the marble like a reset that didn't quite work anymore. Yesterday clung to the space, faint but undeniable. He moved through his routine with practiced ease, though he felt the difference immediately. People looked at him longer now, not rudely, not with mockery, with awareness. It sat heavier on his shoulders than invisibility ever had. Near the elevators, a small group of employees stood waiting, murmuring quietly. When he approached to mop a spill near their feet, one stepped aside without being asked. Another thanked him again, more naturally this time. He nodded and kept moving. Gratitude still felt unfamiliar when it wasn't followed by dismissal. Upstairs, Maribel stood alone in the boardroom, staring at the city blurred by rain-streaked windows. She hadn't slept much. The memo had gone out. The press response had been mixed, predictable. Some praised the honesty, others questioned the sincerity. She accepted both. What mattered now was follow-through. A knock sounded. Her assistant entered, careful, respectful. "He's here," she said. Maribel nodded. "Send him in." The office was quieter than the lobby, insulated and controlled. He stepped inside without hesitation, boots leaving faint damp prints on the carpet. He didn't look around. He'd seen rooms like this before, from the other side of a different life. The familiarity surprised him more than the luxury. She gestured for him to sit. He remained standing, and that choice landed between them, subtle but unmistakable. Maribel exhaled slowly and adjusted, folding her hands in front of her instead. Power no longer assumed posture, it negotiated it. "I won't take much of your time," she said. "I wanted to speak directly, without an audience." He nodded once, signaling she could continue. She acknowledged the harm plainly, without softening language. She spoke about assumptions, about how easily systems erased people while congratulating themselves for efficiency. Her voice stayed steady, but her eyes betrayed the effort it took. When she finished, she waited. Not for forgiveness, for response. He considered her words carefully. He didn't rush to fill the silence. He thought of the lobby, the laughter, the dare. He thought of the corridor, the work that waited no matter who noticed. Finally, when he spoke, he told her he hadn't played to teach anyone a lesson. He'd played because he was tired of shrinking, because his daughter deserved a world where dignity didn't depend on titles. His voice never rose. It didn't need to. Maribel listened without interrupting, something she rarely did without calculation. When he finished, she nodded, eyes damp but clear. "You're right," she said quietly. "And I can't undo what's already happened. But I can decide what happens next." She offered him a role. Not as a performer, not as a symbol, a position that recognized his skill without erasing his choice to work where he did. Flexibility, respect, visibility without spectacle. He didn't answer immediately. The rain intensified outside, tapping against the glass in uneven rhythm. He thought of Lena, of time, of how easily opportunity could become another form of pressure. When he finally spoke, his answer was measured. He declined the role as she'd framed it. He told her he wasn't interested in being elevated as an exception. He wanted the changes promised to apply to everyone, not just him. If she was serious about correction, it had to be systemic. Maribel's breath caught, not an offense but realization. She nodded slowly. "Then help me build that," she said. Not a command, an invitation. He hesitated, then agreed to one condition. His involvement would be quiet, no press, no speeches. He would advise from the margins where he understood the work best. Change didn't need a spotlight to be real. They shook hands. The gesture felt different than any corporate agreement either had made before. Equal, grounded. When he left the office, and the hallway felt longer, heavier with implication. He walked it steadily, returning to the elevator without looking back. The doors closed softly. Downstairs, the lobby waited, unchanged and altered all at once. The piano stood where it always had, but no one lingered near it now. It had served its purpose. He picked up his cart and resumed his route. Upstairs, Maribel watched the elevator numbers descend, feeling something settle into place. Leadership, she realized, wasn't about control. It was about repair. The rain slowed by afternoon, sunlight breaking through in hesitant patches. The building adjusted again, this time not in reaction but in tension. The reversal had completed itself, not with applause or headlines, but with a recalibration of power that witnesses would carry forward. And for the first time in years, the tower felt honest. The days that followed didn't explode outward. They settled in. That was how real change announced itself. Not with another viral clip or a press conference, but with quieter adjustments that forced people to notice what they'd ignored before. He felt it in the way schedules were posted with actual consideration, in how supervisors asked instead of ordered, in the absence of jokes that once hid behind just teasing. The building still rose before him every morning, all glass and ambition, but it no longer felt sealed off from the labor that kept it standing. He moved through it steadily, cart rolling, keys clipped to his belt, senses tuned to small disruptions. The work hadn't changed. The meaning around it had. People stopped him sometimes now, not to gawk, to ask questions about systems, about overlooked problems, about how things actually functioned when no one was watching. He answered when he could and redirected when he couldn't. Authority was learning to listen from below instead of shouting down. Maribel noticed the shift too. She walked the floors without announcement, heels quiet, posture intentionally unarmored. Staff straightened when they saw her, then relaxed when she nodded and kept moving. She observed more than she spoke, watching interactions recalibrate in real time. Respect, she was learning, couldn't be mandated. It had to be modeled until it caught. She held to the changes she'd promised, even when it complicated timelines and irritated partners. A few executives pushed back. She let them. Resistance clarified priorities. Those unwilling to adjust revealed themselves quickly. At home, life stayed grounded. He cooked simple meals, helped with homework. sat beside Lena when her breathing tightened, counting with her until the fear eased. She asked once why people on her tablet kept talking about a piano. He told her adults sometimes needed reminders about listening. She accepted that easily, satisfied. The piano remained in the lobby, uncovered now, no longer guarded by velvet ropes. Anyone could approach it. Most didn't. A few did, tentatively, playing clumsy notes and laughing at themselves. No one was mocked. That mattered. One evening, as he wiped down a nearby railing, a young intern sat and played a halting melody. She stopped midway, embarrassed. He shook his head gently, encouraging. She tried again, steadier this time. The sound wasn't extraordinary, the permission was. Maribel watched from a distance, unseen. She felt the tightness in her chest loosen, just a fraction. This was what repair looked like when it wasn't performative. Slow, uneven, real. The press cycle moved on, as it always did. New outrage, new heroes. The clip faded into background noise, referenced occasionally in think pieces and panels. He didn't attend any. His influence stayed where he'd insisted it remain, in the margins, shaping without spectacle. Weeks passed. Policies settled into practice. The novelty wore off, leaving structure behind. That was the true test. When attention left, did the changes hold? They did, not perfectly, not everywhere, but enough to matter. He noticed it most in the way new hires were introduced to the building. Names spoken, roles explained without hierarchy dripping from every syllable. He watched people stand a little straighter, not because they were being watched, but because they felt counted. Maribel's legacy began to shift in conversations she wasn't part of. Not softened, reframed. A leader who'd been forced to see, and who hadn't looked away afterward. She didn't cling to the narrative. She focused on the work. One night, long after the building emptied, he paused near the piano again. The lobby lights were dimmed, the space hushed. He rested a hand briefly on the instrument's smooth surface, not playing, just acknowledging the place where something had changed direction. Then he turned back to his cart. Some victories announced themselves loudly. Others embedded quietly into routine until they became difficult to undo. This one belonged to the latter. Power had adjusted. Dignity had expanded. And a single dare meant to humiliate had become a correction no one could unsee. The building stood as it always had, but now it carried a different weight, one shaped by witnesses who knew better, and by a man who had refused to disappear when it mattered most. The morning light reached the lobby slowly, sliding across marble that had learned new habits. He arrived before most people, as he always did, keys cold in his hand, breath steady. The building greeted him with quiet instead of indifference, a subtle but meaningful difference that still surprised him some days. He started his route the same way he always had. Floors first, then glass, then the small things no one noticed unless they were wrong. The work grounded him, kept him honest. Whatever had changed around him, this remained true. Places only stayed functional because someone cared enough to maintain them. Near the piano, he paused longer than usual. It wasn't nostalgia that stopped him. It was perspective. The instrument sat in open light now, no rope, no sign explaining its importance. Just a piano. It belonged to the space instead of symbolizing it. He saw a few faint fingerprints on the lid and wiped them away without ceremony. Footsteps approached behind him. Maribel Voss stopped a respectful distance away. No entourage, no interruption. She didn't speak right away. She'd learned the value of waiting. "They've approved the long-term changes," she said finally. Not unanimously, but enough. He nodded, absorbing the information without celebration. Systems didn't transform because of votes alone. They transformed because people enforced them when it was inconvenient. She watched him work, then added, "I won't pretend this fixes everything, but it's real, and it's staying." He met her eyes briefly, then returned to the piano lid. "That's what matters," he said. The words were simple. They didn't need polish. She hesitated, then smiled, not the sharp, performative kind, but something quieter. "You never asked for credit," she said. He shrugged lightly. "Credit fades, habits don't." They stood there a moment longer, two people who no longer needed to perform for each other. Then she turned and walked away, heels echoing softly before fading into the upper floors. The day unfolded without spectacle. People came and went. Meetings started late. Someone spilled coffee near the elevators. He cleaned it up. A few employees greeted him by name. A few didn't. Both felt normal now. At lunch, he sat outside on the same concrete wall, unwrapped the same kind of sandwich. The city moved around him, unbothered by what had happened inside one building weeks ago. He liked that. It reminded him the world was bigger than moments, even powerful ones. That evening, he arrived home on time. Lena was at the table, coloring, her breathing easy. She looked up and grinned when she saw him. "I played today," she said proudly. "At school." He raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah?" She nodded vigorously. "I messed up, but I kept going." He smiled, warmth spreading through him in a way no applause ever had. "That's the part that matters," he told her. They ate dinner together, talked about small things, homework, weather, a classmate who talked too much. Life continued in the way it always did, quietly, insistently. Later, when she'd fallen asleep, he stood by the window for a moment, city lights blinking back at him. Somewhere out there, people still shared the video, still argued about meaning and intent. He let them. The truth no longer belonged to the internet. It lived in practice now. The next week, a new hire joined the facilities team. Nervous, unsure. He showed them where supplies were kept, explained the quirks of the building, pointed out the loose tile near the elevators. The work passed on as it always should. Near the end of his shift, music drifted faintly through the lobby, not polished, not practiced. Just someone testing notes, uncertain but unafraid. He listened for a moment, then continued on, and the sound following him down the corridor like proof that permission had been granted where it once hadn't existed. The victory had never been about proving who he was. It had been about refusing to accept who he was allowed to be. And that refusal, quiet, steady, witnessed, had reshaped more than one room. It had expanded the space for others to stand a little taller, to try without being mocked, to exist without shrinking first. Before you go, ask me for the next story title you want to hear. Subscribe, and don't miss our next story. Single dad janitor was dared to play the piano. What he played made the CEO cry. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?